couple of months later, I was having dinner with Bobby in New York, and the subject came up. And he said to me, you know, this Cassini case was the last thing I was looking to prosecute. But he said, what's right is right. And from then on, I knew that this was a guy with enormous, maybe unique integrity in politics.
We made some recommendations for legislation which we feel would make a major impact on the operations of the big-time gamblers and racketeers throughout the country.
Kennedy's great achievement as Attorney General came as a gangbuster. Organized crime was in its heyday, and it was Robert Kennedy who turned history's tide and broke the back of the mob. Despite the fact that the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, maintained the fiction that organized crime did not exist. Kennedy surfaced mob informer Joe Valachi on national television in hearings conducted by his old mentor, John McClellan. He increased successful mob prosecutions by 700%.
McClellan wanted Valachi to testify. The Bureau was opposed. There was a big meeting up in Bob's office. I strongly recommended that he be permitted to testify, and he did. And from that point on, there was a general agreement among all law enforcement agencies, state and federal, that this mafia organization existed. That was one of the major achievements of Robert Kennedy's administration.
At the moment President Kennedy was shot, his brother Robert, the Attorney General, was home on a lunch break from a special meeting with federal prosecutors about his war against organized crime. Later that afternoon, he told his aide, Edwin Guthman, "I thought they might get one of us, but I thought it would be me."
He had committed himself to going to a Christmas party for orphans that Mary McRory, the Washington newswoman, put on every year, and he decided to fulfill that obligation. It was not far from the Justice Department, maybe 8 or 9 blocks. I remember people on the street looking at him. They hadn't seen him. He just had disappeared, just kind of watching him, and he went by them without even seeing them. We got to where the party was going to be. It was on the 2nd floor, and we went upstairs, and he walked in, and I can't tell you how melancholy he was, you know. And he walked in. The adults looked at him. There were a lot of kids, orphans. And one little kid, I think he was maybe about 6 years old, ran towards him, stopped in front of him, and looked up at him and said, "Your brother's dead. Your brother's dead." Well, every adult in that place just wanted to be somewhere else. The kid realized that, without knowing what it was, had said something. He realized he had said something wrong. He started to cry. And I'll never forget this. Bobby just reached down and grabbed him, pulled him up and held him very close to him, and said, "That's all right. I have another one."
Then in June of 1964, the family was dealt still another blow. Senator Edward Kennedy was seriously injured in a plane crash. His back was broken. For a time, the family feared the youngest Kennedy would not live. "Is it ever going to end for you people?" a reporter asked Robert Kennedy. "I was just thinking," he answered, "if my mother hadn't had any more children than her first 4, she would have nothing now. I guess the only reason we've survived is that there are more of us than there is trouble." The senator would remain hospitalized for 6 months.
After the events of November 22nd of 1963, I really had to determine what direction I wanted to go in my own life, and I wanted to serve President Johnson and the administration for a period of time, but obviously my whole relationship with the administration, my relationship with the government had changed drastically because of those events. I didn't know whether I wanted to stay in government. I didn't know whether I wanted to teach. I didn't know whether in some way that I'd like to go back to take some graduate courses and study and read a little while. So I was struggled with that for 5 or 6 months. And I knew that I was going to leave. It was just a question of when and where I was going to go. I finally decided that I'd like to stay in government, and decided to run for the United States Senate.
Over the past few weeks, many leading members of the Democratic and the Liberal parties here in the state of New York have talked to me about being a candidate for the United States Senate.
I know it's been dramatized that the torch was dropped and whether I picked it up. I think there were a lot of people who felt that they would like to carry on something that they felt very strongly and fervently about during that period of time, and I'm one of them.
You know, as I was touring upstate, I kept seeing these signs saying, "Go back home." Carpetbagger, go home, and now here I am. You know, I even had problems when I was upstate. And people couldn't understand my accent. And I explained it was Glen Cove and Long Island. They don't know what you're saying. You say the cop went down the path, and they don't know what that means.
Mr. Kennedy, I'd like to ask you a question which seems to me very close to the heart of the matter, and if it sounds blunt, so be it. Aren't you really using New York State as a kind of jumping off place for your own presidential ambitions?
First, let me say, I have really two choices over the period of the last 10 months. I could have stayed in, I could have retired, and my father has done very well, and I could have lived off him. Frankly, I don't need the title, because I could be called general, I understand, for the rest of my life. I've been and I don't need the money, and I don't need the office space. So I would just, I mean, frank as it is, and maybe it's difficult to understand in the state of New York, I'd like to just be a good United States Senator. I'd like to serve. President Kennedy's favorite quote was really from Dante. But the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in time of moral crisis preserve their neutrality.
I don't think he was a quintessential senator. I think he was a quintessential executive kind of person, a doer.
He was not very good at that stuff, I would say. You know, he got bored in the hearings, the minutiae of amendments, and because I think he understood that almost everybody else had another agenda that had to do with hometown business, campaign supporters, unions, corporations, causists of various kinds. You know, he never saw a lobbyist.